Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Knowing Me, Knowing You, Confucian Epistemology. Dad knows how to make fried noodles. As a pediatric dentist, Grandma knew how to look after children's teeth. 3-year-old Chris now knows how to ride a bicycle without training wheels. Grandpa doesn't know how to use a smartphone, but couldn't care less. That last one is an exceptional case, because usually knowledge is enabling. Having knowledge can often mean that a person who knows something that others don't is more powerful or is seen to deserve more respect. To be in the know is to have an advantage over those who aren't, though sometimes acting on knowledge can get people into trouble, like when they engage in insider trading. Philosophers nowadays tend to think about knowledge in propositional terms. They see it as a kind of belief, one that goes beyond mere belief, because to have knowledge is not just to believe that some proposition is true, but to believe in a proposition that actually is true, and to do so in the right way, like with a certain kind of justification or warrant. Indeed, specifying what exactly turns a belief into knowledge has been a main preoccupation of epistemologists for quite some time now, epistemology being the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge. The conception of knowledge in Warring States philosophy was rather different. While philosophers did think about attitudes towards propositions, as when we have beliefs or deem some proposition to be true, their explorations of epistemology went well beyond that. Christoph Harbsmeyer, a scholar of historical linguistics and history of logic in China, distinguishes between three dominant conceptions of knowing at work in these texts. They are knowing things, knowing how to do things, and finally the more familiar idea of knowing that a sentence or statement is true or false. In addition, the Chinese texts reflect deeply on the nature and structure of knowing, the social usefulness of knowing, and the objective reliability of knowing. We won't be able to cover all these topics in this episode, but we'll start to do so and return to the topic in future episodes as we bring in discussions on knowledge in the other Chinese traditions. For the early Confucians, knowledge has an important place in making life better. Mengzi takes knowledge, zhi, to be one of the 4 sprouts, the inborn capacities that enable our moral development. He and the other Confucians view knowledge as being closely intertwined with processes such as reflecting, pondering, and prioritizing. In fact, they are more interested in how knowing something enables us to act effectively than they are in theoretical questions about the knowledge itself. They focus on knowing, which is something we do, rather than on knowledge, which is something we have, especially knowing how to undertake moral cultivation to participate in the transformation of society. Philosophers have thus commented that Confucian epistemology aligns more closely with activity-based knowing, or knowing how, the sorts of knowing illustrated by the examples with which we began this episode, like knowing how to make fried noodles. This is contrasted with knowing an idea or having some information, such as, for example, knowing that the population of India is approximately 1.4 billion. This second type of knowing is often called knowing that. Here we actually have a point of convergence between ancient Chinese theories of knowledge and contemporary philosophy. Even if the idea of knowledge as a form of belief has been dominant in modern times, the philosopher Gilbert Ryle already argued in the middle of the 20th century that knowledge how is a special and important kind of knowledge, one that is not reducible to knowing that. While it is useful to draw this connection, we shouldn't overdraw it. We don't want to give the impression that Chinese philosophers did not seek to find out about the world, or that they were not concerned about knowing something accurately or about seeking the truth. Although texts from the Warring States period were generally more focused on knowing how, they did also refer to other forms of knowing. Furthermore, their conceptions of knowing do not always fit neatly under the labels knowing how and knowing that. The scholar Lisa Reifels sets out 3 conceptions of zhi, the character most closely associated with knowing in the Analects. First, zhi refers to a form of knowing that is implied in the mastery of a set of ideas, expressed as rules for appropriate conduct contained in a body of written texts. A second form of knowing is more closely aligned with knowing how. It relates to the ongoing refinement of one's moral character, embodied in a set of practices described in the texts. Third, there is an ability to recognize and at times predict situations in life, and to bring one's conduct in line with the guidance provided by the texts. These three forms of knowing incorporate both the grasping of ideas and modes of action, so it seems that they combine components of both knowing that and knowing how. Harbsmeyer's comment on what it means to know Dao, zhi Dao, agrees with what Reifel says about zhi. Harbsmeyer says that zhi Dao, knowing the way, is knowing how to go about things. To help us understand the Confucian conception of knowing how to go about things, let's look at two examples of the use of zhi in the Analects. First, the phrase knowing men, zhi ren. This is an important phrase that continues to be used in Confucian philosophy. Simply expressed, for a ruler to know men means having the capacity to select capable men for office, and in particular, to appoint people with the right capabilities to undertake tasks in their official roles. Given the ruler's dependence on his advisors, getting this right is essential for good government. Different aspects of what we would broadly call knowing are required in this task of appointing the right people. For starters, the ruler would need to know about the strengths and weaknesses of individual advisors, which we might call knowing their track record. The ruler might acquire this information from hearsay, or he could observe the person in action firsthand, knowing him by acquaintance. He would also need to know the kinds of capacities required for a particular position. What assets does a treasurer need to have? What about an assistant treasurer? In short, the ruler needs to know whether this person's capabilities makes him fit for this position. Of course, the question of fit is not just a theoretical issue. The ruler has to size up each individual, considering his attitudes, dispositions, quick-wittedness, and emotional intelligence. Sure, the potential assistant treasurer is good at accounting and is honest, but will he be able to work with the treasurer? We might describe these aspects of knowledge as understanding. That is, a good ruler has the capacity of understanding his advisors. But whatever words we use, it is clear that knowing men is not merely a case of knowing that or knowing how. When Kong Tzu was asked about zhi, meaning the zhi relevant to a ruler, his response was that the ruler should know men. When asked to elaborate, Kong Tzu said, "Raise up the straight and apply them to the crooked, and the crooked will be made straight." Here we see themes that have come up before. We have the Confucian emphasis on the crucial role of the political advisor, a role they often hope to play themselves, and the ruler's use of virtue as an instrument, a ruler in a different sense, if you will, for guiding others towards virtue. The ultimate goal is nothing less than the moral transformation of society, and it is by knowing men that the ruler extends his own virtue through the rest of society. So a capacity to coordinate the overall coherence of government is central to Confucian leadership. We might call such oversight wisdom, in that it relates not merely to having some relevant information, knowing that certain statements or beliefs are true, but in using the information relevantly in light of Confucian values. Another way in which the idea of making wise decisions is expressed in Confucian philosophy is in how we prioritize matters. We have also seen that making distinctions and weighing matters appropriately are important parts of Sun Tzu's philosophy. The Mengzi comments that some don't know how to prioritize matters correctly. A person will travel a long distance to get an injured fourth finger fixed, yet is unbothered when their heart-mind is not right. Mengzi adds, this is what is called a failure to understand distinctions. Typically in the Analects, when the term zhi is coupled with another word, as in the phrase knowing men, the coupling expresses a pragmatic consideration. In other words, to zhi, or know something, is to take appropriate action. This is true of warring states discourse more generally. For example, the phrase knowing destiny, zhi ming, which occurs in the Analects and elsewhere, emphasizes the importance of understanding what is given in life. Knowing destiny means properly orientating oneself to the significant changes that can be made within life, rather than dwelling on those aspects of life that cannot be changed. Another example from the Analects is the coupling of zhi with propriety, zhi li. To know li is not merely to know the set of right responses and how they fit within a range of circumstances, it is about enacting those responses appropriately. Those who know li understand that our behaviors and our responses to others in accordance with propriety reflect what we take to be important. In one anecdote in the Analects, Kong Tzu visited a Meizi temple and kept asking questions about everything. An observer at the temple was unimpressed and scoffed. Who said that this man knows propriety? When he went into the great ancestral temple, he had to ask questions about everything. When Kongzi heard this response, he said simply, "This is indeed propriety." The critic of Kongzi assumed his questions were a sign of ignorance, whereas they were in fact expressions of deference and humility. Both knowing men and knowing propriety involve having relevant knowledge of the issue at hand and knowing how to do some things. For example, Kongzi's asking many questions at the temple implies that he knows that he needs to act according to propriety to express humility, and he also knows how to embody propriety. But these two forms of knowing cannot help us explain Kongzi's asking questions in this case. He took account of the circumstances and acted fittingly. Back before she launched her podcasting career, Karen suggested in a research article that a form of knowing in the Analects, such as in the examples we've just seen, might be best described as knowing to. With the case of Kongzi at the temple, we might say he knew to ask questions. By doing so, he enacted humility and deference. The idea of knowing to brings out the appropriateness of action taken under particular circumstances. Here, a question arises that is similar to the one raised by Ryle's work more than 50 years ago. As we mentioned, philosophers have wondered whether or not knowing how can be reduced to knowing that. For example, perhaps knowing how to make fried noodles could be cashed out as knowing that a long list of propositions is true. It's true that the noodles should be fried in oil. It's true that the oil needs to be hot before the noodles go in, and so on. Or perhaps not. For example, maybe there is no one proposition or set of propositions that expresses the cook's sense of when to stop frying the noodles because they are done. Similarly, here, we can ask whether Kongzi's knowing to ask questions is really just the same as knowing how to show propriety. Consider a cyclist who has been riding for years. One day she encounters a bump on the road. To avoid crashing, she shifts her weight. We may say that she knew to negotiate the bump successfully. This makes knowing to a success concept. That is, we say of someone that they knew to do something only when they have succeeded in doing that very thing. This is not true of knowing how. People who know how to ride bikes do sometimes crash after all. A second difference is that knowing to involves responding to a specific situation, like that particular bump when riding at that speed in those traffic conditions and so on. That the cyclist knew to shift her weight on this occasion doesn't mean that she could get past any bump on any other road. By contrast, knowing how is usually said in reference to general skills like knowing how to ride a bike. A third related point is that knowing to do something implies, well, doing something. You can know how to ride a bike while you're at home, asleep in bed, whereas knowing to shift your weight on a bike means actually shifting your weight. Here we might compare how the good ruler shows that he knows men by knowing to actually appoint specific advisors who can work with one another, rather than appointing each one based on their merits alone. We may also think of knowing to in terms of its timeliness. Although the word refers to time, we do not simply mean that an action was taken at the right time. We use the word timely to express that an action was undertaken fittingly. It is in this sense that Kongzi was called the timely sage by Mengzi. Mengzi said of Kongzi that when it was right to act quickly, he was quick. When it was right to be deliberate, he was deliberate. When it was right to retire, he retired. When it was right to serve, he served. That was Kongzi. Thus, we might say that Kongzi knew to leave the service of a given ruler, because he could see that the ruler would never be brought to the exercise of the kingly way. He left the ruler as soon as this became clear, no sooner and no later, and also in an appropriate fashion. The idea of timeliness has another important aspect to it, which makes knowing to a fitting way to think about epistemology in Confucian philosophy. When we say that someone's action was timely, we imply that the action was done appropriately. This is connected to what we said earlier about knowing to involving success. To tug at a child's arm to prevent him from falling into a well is a timely action. It is appropriate as it succeeds in preventing the child from coming to harm. To say that an action is timely is thus just another way of expressing that a person knew to undertake that action at that point in time and succeeded in doing so. To return to Kongzi at the temple, his asking questions on that occasion in that setting was timely. By knowing to ask questions at the temple, he appropriately embodied deference and reverence, and therefore we say that Kongzi knew propriety. There's one final aspect of knowing to we should consider, and that is the question of how we learn this kind of knowing. We expect that different types of knowing are learned by undertaking different practices. If we want to know that something is true, we might read a credible source or speak to someone who is an expert. If we want to know how to do something, we most likely have to learn by practicing it. Thinking about the kind of learning that corresponds to knowing too can help demonstrate the importance of timely action in the early Confucian tradition and also bring out why cultivation is a central issue in Confucian philosophy. Given that knowing too concerns acting appropriately in different circumstances, the learning process must involve familiarity with as many relevant scenarios as possible. This involves not only the kind of learning by doing that we undertake in order to acquire know-how. Typically, we get to know how to do something by mere repetition. Fry those noodles 10 or 12 times and you'll have it down. But the kind of learning required for knowing too requires us to pay close attention to a range of circumstances where we might enact that activity. Consider driving a car. Once we can adeptly manage and coordinate the steering, brakes, appropriate use of the mirrors, signaling to other drivers, and the road rules, we might say we know how to drive a car. But knowing to give way on a specific occasion, brake for a jaywalking pedestrian, or navigate an intersection when the traffic lights have stopped working requires drivers to factor in the relevant details of the situation. This is why learners are required to practice driving for hours and not just demonstrate that they know how to drive. The challenge of learning to be responsive to circumstances takes us back to another idea we've seen before, the imitation of role models. Such models are all around us, or so say the Confucians. We should try to act like the sages and try not to act like tyrants. Sun Tzu especially puts great emphasis on the importance of teachers and models. We can learn about their successors and failures by reading about them, as the Analects advises us to do. We can also inquire and listen. An important way to understand how to act in a timely way is through observation, specifically by observing others in given situations. Kung Tzu said that he used to simply take people at their word, but having made Zai Wo's acquaintance, you might remember Zai Wo tried to get out of the 3-year mourning period, Kung Tzu realized that it's more important to observe how people proceed in life rather than to rely on what they say. Contrastingly, he thought his student Yan Hui seemed a bit stupid when teaching him, but then observed that his behavior demonstrated how much he had learned. With all this information at hand, from listening, reading, inquiring, and observing, we need to reflect and introspect on where we stand. For this sake, it might be timely for us to quote Kung Tzu's reminder about learning and reflection. If you learn without reflecting on what you have learned, you will be lost. If you reflect without learning, however, you will fall into danger. But having learned all about Confucian epistemology, you can safely reflect on it until it's time for the next episode of The History of Philosophy in China.